All right, Battleground Nova Scotia, where the campaigning remains hot and heavy despite the fact that our poll and other public domain polls seem to suggest that one party, in this case the Liberals, has a dominant lead, and yet everybody keeps campaigning. But as we keep stressing, we've seen public domain polling turned on its head in both Alberta and BC, just a couple of recent examples. So how might we tie in or look at what happened in BC and Alberta and use that to help us learn about what might happen in Nova Scotia? Well, to help us with that, we're joined by New Democrat organizer, supporter, backroom conniver, Joe Cressy in our Toronto studios. Joe, it's good to have you here.
Good to be here.
You watched elections in BC, and everybody kind of went, I know New Democrats were disappointed and a little bit surprised. In Alberta, we saw a very surprising result. And here in Nova Scotia, it's my sense New Democrats at the very least, and you were out there last week, they know things can change around, and they're not leaving any tool in the toolbox this time, and I speak mostly in negative ads there. What's your sense? Can you help us sort of tie all that together?
Sure. I think there is an incumbency advantage in uncertain economic times, and I think we've seen that again and again. You mentioned Alberta and British Columbia, but I'd extend it a little further. You look in Quebec, where the Liberals surpassed expectations, didn't win, but did well.
But lost by a whisper, you're right.
You got it. You look at Ontario, where you had the provincial Liberals here come from 20 points back to pull out a minority. So there is an incumbency advantage, and part of that is making the case of stability versus risk. And that lends itself to these uncertain times. You know, I would go one step further and say, look south of the border in the last presidential election. Barack Obama had a one-word tagline, forward. What's the opposite of forward? Backwards. He was making the case we can move forward together or go backwards. It's a risk argument.
I absolutely buy that, but I think in BC and Alberta, the incumbents had something on their side, and that is the behavior of the opposition leader. In this case, Adrian Dix, who was ahead in the polls of the BC NDP, and Daniel Smith in the Wild Rose Party. Because if you're trying to sell the narrative that the other guy is risky, I think Dix validated that narrative with his mid-campaign Kinder Morgan surprise. Daniel Smith had some quote-unquote bozo moments where candidates wanted to talk about social issues, distracted things. And so far in Nova Scotia, Stephen McNeil is not playing along. Though Dexter is saying he's risky, McNeil basically is being accused of having no platform at all.
Yeah, you know, there's different ways to prove the high-risk argument. I think you have to do two things. First of all, the incumbent party has to prove that they are a stable alternative that should continue to govern. That's the first thing that has to happen for the incumbent party. But on the other side, as you say, sometimes it can be self-inflicted. Sometimes you get lucky. In Alberta, with a number of the candidates who ran who were saying some crazy things around homosexuality and others. Certainly in British Columbia, you mentioned the mid-campaign move, but there's another piece here. It's not always that it's self-inflicted. Sometimes you can help to push that narrative by running a rather negative campaign. And I think that's what you saw in British Columbia, that the Liberals tried very hard to undermine the credibility of Adrian Dix. And that campaign began months before the election with radio advertisements to take his credibility on. So I think you see those two ways happen around making the risk argument. But there is a third option, and this is what the Nova Scotia NDP is doing here, and that's to present a clear and hard contrast. It's to say, on the one hand, things are moving steady, we're making progress, and if you don't stick with us, it's a high risk. Now, that's a clear argument. You need to make it hard, you need to push it very rigorously, but there's a way to do that that isn't negative.
And it's, let me say it another way, I think we're saying the same thing. It could be negative, but it's not nasty the way it was, and personal, the way it seemed to get against Dix in BC. Dexter is trying to make that case. He's saying Stephen McNeil is going to, close more beds. Stephen McNeil voted to raise the HST on home heating oil, et cetera, et cetera. That's negative, but it's not nasty.
Yeah, you know, I always like to make a contrast between there are negative ads, and those are personal. And then there are hard contrast ads, and those are on the issues. And they're very different. There is also the line Rick Mercer used at once that negative ads work and stupid ads don't. Well, I think the hard negative ads that work are the ones that show a clear contrast on the issues. And that's what the Nova Scotia NDP, frankly, has to do in this last week. And we know that the polls can certainly surprise us. We saw that in the British Columbia and Alberta elections. But they have to frame the ballot question in these last 6 days. And that question, in their eyes, has to be slow and steady progress, stay with us, or high risk on the other hand.
Well, let's finish on this note then, because that's the other thing that I wonder if we're seeing a new trend, and that is a highly volatile electorate, that electorates now are changing en masse, spinning on a dime. We even go back to 2009. If you take a look at the trend line on the polls, it was a really quick, sharp uptick for the NDP that produced the Dexter majority. And same thing was the final weekends that did it in BC and Alberta. Is this a new era we're in?
Well, you know, what I would say that today's era, voters aren't as ideologically driven, and they're not as closely aligned with parties. Voters en masse across this country care about issues. It's much more what issue relates to me. Is it about the pocketbook? Is it about the environment? Is it about the economy? But there are issues voters move on. And of course, there are the intangibles around character and trust, but it's the issues. And for that reason, elections can certainly move on a dime. Just look at 2011 and the Orange Wave.
Would you rather, as I said that was going to be the last one, but last quick one. Would you rather be up by 20 points or down by 20 points with 5 days to go?
I'd rather be up, but this is the fourth quarter and it's the 2-minute warning, and we'll see what happens.
All right, Joe Cressy joining us from Toronto. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you.
Okay.